In November 1852, a man was brought out of the sewer that served as a dungeon for the worst criminals of Persia. His crime was to claim that society must change. He came before the court of the Shah, bowed by the chains and dressed in the rags he'd worn for 4 dark months underground, and he heard sentence pronounced against him. He was granted life on pain of banishment. He was stripped of everything that he possessed. No chance was given him to defend himself. The prisoner's name was Mirza Hussein Ali of Noor, and he was known by those who loved him as Bahaullah. Bahaullah was a nobleman with revolutionary ideas. He was a prince who defended the oppressed, and many called him the father of the poor. It was because he posed a puzzle to Persian society and was a threat to power that he was exiled on foot and dispossessed of all across the mountains from Tehran to Baghdad, the first of many banishments. But the king who banished him did not know that this prisoner carried a secret more weighty than his chains. What was it like to be dispossessed in the past? What was it like to be homeless when homes were built to last forever, when rich was what you were born with, and the poor were always with us? When your skin color decided whether you were one of us or one of them? What was it like to be stripped of dignity and disgraced when those were the ways you measured men and condemned women? When Bahaullah was exiled in 1852, he was among the dispossessed of the earth, the rejects of society, stripped of dignity, deprived of belongings and doubtful of themselves. Sufferings the same in every century.
We found no more than a handful of souls, faint and dispirited, nay, utterly lost and dead.
How do you begin again when you're faint and dispirited? Where do you find the courage to continue when the spirit is lost and dead? Regeneration is not easy. It doesn't always depend on welfare. It isn't always provided for by social security. Something more than a paycheck must revive the heart, resuscitate the soul.
Noble have I created thee.
To the eternal I call thee.
With the tidings of light I hail thee.
O Son of Man, rejoice.
Up from thy mortal cage,
and wing thy flight unto the placeless.
Guided by Bahaullah, the exiles in Baghdad revived. They regained faith in themselves and in the power of change. They became distinctive for their unity. They shared everything. They owned nothing. They came into possession of their true selves. A community began to emerge in Baghdad that Bahaullah claimed had the power to change the world. Power in the 19th century generally moved in one direction, from up to down. Leadership was imposed rather than served the general good. Authority was absolute, and those who wielded it did so absolutely. But in the middle of the last century, when Napoleon III was re-establishing one empire and the British were expanding another, a new kind of power was emerging which had nothing to do with empires. Bahaullah became a guiding light in Baghdad, a leading authority. Everyone was going to the coffee houses to talk about him. Everyone said people shared what they had because of him, and yet his authority was freely given. His power defied age-old definitions, and they were impressed. But he was envied as much as he was admired.
The well-known Mirza Hussein Ali of Noor is in Baghdad, and many have gathered round him with sudden expectations.
And soon the rumors began to circulate among government officials and ecclesiastic leaders.
He's surrounded by nearly 200 followers.
Secretly prompting and misleading foolish persons and ignorant weaklings.
If he could only be arrested, the rest of them will be scattered.
They number more than 3,000.
He's becoming stronger, hour by hour.
The situation is very dangerous.
We cannot procrastinate any longer.
I would request the removal of this source of mischief from a center like Baghdad.
Another banishment. But on the eve of his second banishment, in a garden outside the city, Bahaullah made the most astounding claim of all.
I am come to you, O people, from the throne of glory, and bear you an announcement from God.
He said this message from God was expected by all the religions of the past.
Every prophet hath announced this day, and every messenger yearned for this revelation.
The religions were one, like the sun, he said. Just as they dawned in the past, so they would rise in the future.
Every one of them is the way of God, connecting this world with the realms above. Each one of them is known by a different name, is characterized by a special attribute, and fulfills a definite mission.
The purpose of his own revelation, he told his followers, was to shelter mankind beneath the tree of unity. This was the power that drew them together. This was the secret he had carried out of Persia. And it was going to change the world. Constantinople, city of dreams and domes, was sinking into the twilight of its powers in 1863. A dying empire among the growing nations of the 19th century. Anything new was very disturbing, and so it wasn't long after Bahaullah arrived, acclaimed by friend and foe on every side, that rumors began to circulate once more.
Informations have been acquired through numerous channels by the
In the face of
intermediate
these
persons of
proceedings,
consideration
proof
worthy
of
of
complete
credence.
negligence and lack of prudence on the part of the Persian
Will
government
not
to
do to
disregard.
leave Mirza Hussein Ali there, or to allow fuller scope to his mischievous ideas and probable
Orders should
actions.
be issued that the cause and root of the mischief be arrested.
By December 1863, within 4 months of his arrival, Bahaullah received orders to leave. It was his third banishment. Another winter, another journey. They traveled under armed escort and on foot, with forced night marches through freezing rain and fog.
A cold of such intensity prevailed that year that none could recall its like. To melt water from the springs, a great fire had to be lit, and kept burning for hours.
When they arrived in Adrianople, they were kennelled in cold and draughty houses before being brought to this building, now carefully restored. It was here that Bahaullah was poisoned by those who were envious of his power, and from here that he sent his first challenge to the rulers of the world. It was an outrageous thing to do by any standards. He was a prisoner, an exile. They were emperors and kings. But he had a mandate to fulfill. And a different kind of power.
O king, I was but a man like others, asleep on my couch, when the breezes of the all-glorious were wafted over me, and taught the knowledge of all that has been. This thing is not from me, but from one who is almighty and all-knowing.
He challenged them to unite and fortify their alliances rather than their borders.
O rulers of the earth, be reconciled among yourselves.
Should any one among you take arms against another, rise ye all against him, for this is naught but manifest justice.
He warned them against fundamentalism and intolerance.
Religious fanaticism and hatred are a world-devouring fire, a desolating affliction, whose violence none can quench.
He urged them to distribute wealth more evenly.
Overstep not the bounds of moderation.
Some possess of an affluent fortune, whilst others are in abject poverty.
He drew their attention to human rights. Denied this right himself, he became the advocate of all who suffered from injustice.
Know ye not why we created you all from the same dust?
If ye fail to safeguard the rights of the downtrodden, what right have ye to vaunt yourselves among men?
Finally, he warned the kings and rulers that if his solutions were ignored, the consequences would be dire indeed, for them and for their people. And his words have been echoed by the rest of us ever since.
How long will humanity persist in its waywardness?
How long will injustice continue? How long is chaos and confusion to reign amongst men?
How long will discord agitate the face of society?
But the rulers at that time took no heed of his warnings.
Tell the king that his territory will pass out of his hands, and his affairs will be thrown into confusion. Not I speak these words, but God speaketh them.
Bahaullah was writing these words in 1868, when the last edict of banishment came, issued by Sultan Abdul Aziz himself. One morning, early, the house was surrounded by soldiers. Guards were posted at the gates, everyone summoned for interrogations. They were ordered to make ready for immediate departure, but no one knew where they were going this time.
The glory of the God of Israel came from the way of the east, like a noise of many waters.
By a strange twist of fate, Bahaullah, who claimed to be the return of God's messengers and the fulfillment of their prophecies, had been sent to the land associated with so many of God's messengers, and the focal point of so many religions. His final banishment had brought him to Akka in the Holy Land. The one they called the God of the Persians had been exiled to the ancient port of Ptolemais, the fortress city of Saint Jean d'Arc of the Crusaders, the meeting ground of Christian, Muslim, and of Jew. And here he was imprisoned for life among murderers and thieves in the penal colony of the Turkish Empire.
The metropolis of the owl.
The most desolate of the cities of the world.
The most unsightly in appearance.
The most detestable in climate.
And the foulest in water.
A darksome well.
A blind pit.
A place where no voice can be heard except the sound of the echo.
Where all the gates of ease and comfort are shut against us, and thick darkness appears to have compassed us on every side.
Bahaullah was confined in this cell for over 2 years, and they were some of the most sorrow-filled years of his life. Isolated from all except his immediate family by the Sultan's decree, under strict surveillance and alone, he paced this room from wall to wall and knew it stone by stone. Bahaullah called Akka the most great prison. Many who'd walked for months to see him were turned away disconsolate from here, and had to stand waiting on the sea wall for days, hoping to catch a glimpse of him, or see his hand waving fleetingly at the prison window. It was during this lonely time that Bahaullah lost his youngest son, who fell fatally from the prison roof one summer's night. His broken body was tossed into a shallow pauper's grave, here, outside the city walls. A brief life, a brutal death. A senseless death, like so many others in our century.
Thou seest me in this day shut up in my prison, and behold my son lying on the dust before thy face. I offered him up, O my God, as a sacrifice in thy path, that thy servants may be quickened, and all that dwell on earth be united.
After almost a decade, though a prisoner still, Bahaullah was free at last to leave the fetid city, and saw green again after so long, and breathed again the vernal air. There was a mansion in the outskirts of the city, surrounded by an ancient grove of trees, and it was called Bahai, which means Garden of Delight. Here he lived the last years of his life, and from here his name was noised abroad. Some came to him for love, and some for envy. Many came for curiosity, and few for truth. But one rare visitor, an eminent scholar from Cambridge University, left us a unique portrait of the prisoner who would change the world.
A second or two elapsed before I became definitely conscious that the room was not untenanted. In the corner where the divan met the wall sat a wondrous and venerable figure. The face of him on whom I gazed I can never forget, though I cannot describe it. No need to ask in whose presence I stood, as I bowed myself before one who is the object of a devotion and love which kings might envy, and emperors sigh for in vain. A mild, dignified voice bade me be seated, and then continued,
Praise be God that thou hast attained. Thou hast come to see a prisoner and an exile. We desire but the good of the world and the happiness of the nations. Yet they deem us worthy of bondage and banishment, that all the nations should become one and all men as brothers, that the bonds of affection and unity be strengthened, and differences of race be annulled. What harm is there in this? Yet so it shall be. These fruitless strifes, these ruinous wars shall pass away, and the most great peace shall come.
On May the 29th, 1892, Bahaullah passed away. And 100 years later, those who call themselves Baha'is, after his name, came to Bahai to commemorate his death. Who are the Baha'is, and where do they come from? Why do they believe in Bahaullah, and what are they doing to share his secret with the world? "100 years after his passing, the faith of Bahaullah has spread from Persia across the entire planet. There are Baha'is now in every country of the world. They believe that mankind is one. They say that religions are also one. And they have addressed themselves to questions related to the problem of prejudice, the balance of power, the distribution of wealth, and the need for peace.
For Rick and Sandra Shickley in Washington, D.C., the most challenging of these issues is racism in the United States, a challenge which Rick faces as counselor to the Supreme Court, and Sandra has faced all her life as a black woman in white America.
The challenge for me is how do I do that? How do I raise a child who recognizes that she is a part of the world, that she's a part of the black race, part of the white race, because that certainly wasn't how I was raised. But that's what I want to do for my child. I don't want her to be ignorant of the racial differences that still exist, that there is racial separation and there are racial tensions, and that she shouldn't be ignorant of that. That's not the issue, but that she should understand that what we're working towards is a society where those differences are joyous and not causes of separation.
For Mona Grieser and Carol Subert, two women who have chosen to work together in their professions, the challenge of raising teenagers begins with racism and goes far beyond. Because it isn't easy to raise children to be open to other cultures and not frame opinions, to be world citizens rather than just black or white Americans.
That's one of the biggest challenges. As our kids become older, the friends that they have that were not like that before, they came from different races, different backgrounds.
At a time when teenagers retreat into their cultural and ethnic identities, Baha'i parents are attempting to help their children do the opposite.
To reach out.
Washington is a city of extremes. Black and white, rich and poor, a city in which family life is easily eroded. These women believe that Bahaullah helps them balance the extremes.
Meanwhile, in Albania, poverty has reached extreme conditions that are hard to imagine in the rest of Europe. Ordinary people face a daily struggle against despair after 40 years of economic and political betrayal that have left them on the breadline.
I have 4 children. I have raised them with suffering and great difficulty. In all this misery, and if I were to tell you the details, I'd just make myself more miserable. In all this time, I've tried to have hope. Perhaps for tomorrow, or the next day, or for a few weeks or months. Because this is not a life which lets us raise children. In fact, it would be better not to have children here.
The challenge for Albanian Baha'is is to retain hope despite despair. For them, Bahaullah's life is an example of this.
Bahaullah was the son of a minister in the court of Persia and had the opportunity to be a wealthy man, but didn't accept it. Instead, he dedicated his life to the service of humanity and to the poor for the unity of the human race. We too are poor, utterly poor. And this faith has given us enormous strength to cope with the difficulties of these times. We're going to rebuild this country and join the rest of Europe, but with dignity, not like beggars. We need to spread the message that the world is one country and that Albanians have our place in the world, and our dignity too.
I have faith in God and hope for the future despite all the problems, because spirituality helps us rise beyond space and time. I accept the Baha'i faith because it's so modern. My dream, like my other friends in the Quartet Baha'i, is to spread the message of the faith through our music.
The Albanian Baha'is say their faith in Bahaullah can help them reconstruct their country.
In Liberia too, a country torn by civil war, belief in Bahaullah has given new energy to the Baha'i community, just as it did in Baghdad so long ago. They used to have a radio station which provided programs of social and economic development all over the country.
Read Baha'i all day long, and I like it, and I love it.
It helped farmers in their fields and women with their children.
Do you sometimes listen to Radio Baha'i?
Yes, all the time.
How do you like it?
I feel alright to it.
And it was destroyed by civil war. This was their radio station, and the Baha'is, many of whom are still in refugee camps, say they are ready to rebuild it just as soon as they can. They are ready to start all over again.
People say I'm Radio Bahai. I'm a George. Go fast when I go Radio Bahai.
Bahaullah gives them spiritual confidence to continue because his voice speaks to the soul.
Above, it's in the air, and you feel there is a sense of being that will hear you.
Chinese Baha'is, coming from a background of Buddhism, Taoism, and more recent communism, have also recognized an ancient spiritual power in the voice of Bahaullah.
I have been a Baha'i for 3 years. Why I become a Baha'i? Because I think the Baha'i thought very close to the Chinese thought.
So for me, there's no conflict between the understanding of Buddhism and the Baha'i faith. Like we draw a circle. The inside is our knowledge, and the outside is the unknown question. That is the beginning of the God.
But that's something that the Marxism is lack of. I mean, they don't have a God. The younger generation, they start to realize the crisis. But on the other hand, currently, the Chinese younger generation, they are kind of the lost generation.
The first time I heard about it is, I'm so happy. I was searching for religion, not only for myself, but also for China.
Nauru is a painter whose work reflects the hieroglyphic language of his Nashi tribe.
Bahai and the Chinese Dao Tong, everybody together.
His dream is to create a language through his art that can speak to everyone in the world. Wu Tianming is known and loved as the godfather of Chinese film.
I'm happy to be a Baha'i now and to have met so many Baha'i friends. I want to work together with them to make this world a better world. Because these ideas are what I've always been seeking. In my films, too.
Baha'i ideas about unity and tolerance, prejudice and power have become familiar to liberal-minded people all over the world. We accept them as common sense without knowing they're Baha'i. In fact, when the leaders of over 170 countries gathered in Rio this year, the Secretary-General of the Earth Summit addressed them in words that echoed those spoken by Bahaullah over 100 years ago.
All of us have our own little communities to which we have loyalty. We have our families. We have our nations. But we now have to enlarge the circle of our allegiance and our consciousness to include the whole planet and to realize that we are first and foremost Earthlings. We inhabit this planet as one family of human beings.
Bahaullah was imprisoned and banished by the kings and rulers of his day because he challenged them to accept this very solution.
The earth is but one country, and mankind its citizens.
Our leaders face the same challenge today. Suffering is always the same. But the difference is that now we hold our leaders accountable for the solutions.
Leaders are, after all, responsible people. And I believe that they will realize that they have, when they come together, a collective responsibility for the future of all the people on our planet that will override their temporary and their short-term preoccupations. I do have faith that these leaders are good leaders, that they will exercise their historic responsibility in real. We have to believe that.
It would seem we have to believe something. But who or what should we believe? If we want to revive our sense of responsibility for the world, if we want to regenerate our belief in the future, we could do worse than ask ourselves about the man who first challenged us to face these issues. This year, the Baha'is are commemorating the passing of Bahaullah. They believe that he renewed the ancient covenant between man and the unknown. They believe his ideas are charged with a spiritual power that makes them more effective than mere reform. They revere him as the secret behind the changes in our century. Perhaps 100 years after his death, it might be timely to consider the nature of his power over the hearts of men.
Stirring within all the peoples of the earth, and yet none hath discovered its cause or perceived its motive.
This is the changeless faith of God, eternal in the past, eternal in the future.